Alright everyone, it is 8 o'clock, so let's get started. I'm going to try to do the face cam if the settings are right. If not, I'm just going to take it off. Um, so, so a pretty detailed discussion about about this pretty strong mid cyclonic system, which is going to impact the pretty much everywhere from Michigan all the way up to Maine, even into the Carolinas, where they could see up to a couple inches of snowfall. This video will mainly be focused on the Delmarva, but I will touch on a little bit of the snowfall for the Ohio Valley, Midwest, and the mountains of North Carolina, and even stretching up to Maryland. So let's get started. So the basic synoptic setup of this is pretty impressive. We are, of course, in a La Nina pattern, which usually means the southern stream or the subtropical jet is not as pronounced, it's more north, while the polar jet is also further north into the northern tier of the country. However, this is more like an El Nino pattern where the southern stream is much more south, going over the Gulf of Mexico, while the polar jet dips south. Now, while the dip of the polar jet isn't as common, like it is now, usually has a nice 45-degree angle dip into the U.S. The southern stream, again, the subtropical jet, is pretty standard. This is a similar pattern of those more powerful storms that come up the I-95 corridor, so there's that. So that's how to set up. This is also going to be a reason why the rainfall will be fairly heavy from the mid-Atlantic all the way up to New England. Now let's start off with the warmer side of this, or the severe weather portion of the system, mainly focused from South Carolina all the way up to parts of New England. Now, I don't have the graphic up from the SPC, but the risk is generally from South Carolina all the way up to southern New Jersey, while the main focus for any tornadoes will be from pretty much Florence, South Carolina, all the way up to Dover, Delaware. Now, there's a better chance near the Virginia-North Carolina border as those discrete supercells could possibly form, and these will be very fast. More on that later. So you have an impressive surge of energy, which is again held back, which will be surged forward into the mid-Atlantic and southeast. And you have a stout EML, or the elevated mix layer, which is going to help storms stay more discrete, stay more by themselves and isolated, whether if this EML was not as pronounced or more moist, like you see in Ohio and Kentucky and Indiana, where it's going to be snowing, Michigan as well, that EML will not be as pronounced, and you would just have one giant mess of storms, like you see with these rainstorms. So that's why you see up in New Jersey, up in New England, you don't have much of an EML because, of course, that is where the heavy rain is. Now, south into North Carolina, you have a lot more dry air at the mid-levels at about 10,000 to 20,000 feet. This is going to help these storms stay isolated, help create their own environment, and I would not be surprised if there's a tornado touchdown somewhere in this area. So now, going back to the relative speed of this, because it is, of course, going to be very fast due to the strong low-level jet. Now, this is about 5,000 feet above the surface, or 850 millibars for those weather enthusiasts. But for those not sure what 850 millibars mean, it's about 5,000 feet up. So the mountains in Colorado, such as Denver, this is your level. Now, the winds are going to be very strong at this level. However, due to a stable layer, I don't expect winds over 70 miles an hour, although there is a high wind warning for parts of Massachusetts, so gusts could top 60. Now, more on that later. Now, this will cause wind shear as those wind directions start to turn as they gain height. So more of a directional shear with some speed shear. And of course, this low-level jet is going to allow the storm motions to be very fast. You're talking 50 to 60 knots or 55 to 65 miles an hour. So these storms are not going to be very chaseable unless you're out ahead of it or just get lucky. So like I'm going to be chasing tomorrow in Delmarva most likely somewhere, and these aren't the setups to really chase. If this is your first real storm chase, I wouldn't really recommend it because it is going to be a pretty tough chase, of course. Because again, fast storm motion stuff might not really form, although it should. The latest cams are saying like a stronger storms or some weaker storms. But again, this low-level jet's going to make the storms very, very fast and have high wind shear. Now, just like any other setup in the mid-Atlantic, it's going to be kind of the lower cape, which is the instability, and it's going to have high wind shear. Now, we don't get wind shear this high in the summertime, and we get higher cape, but this is your typical late fall setup in the mid-Atlantic. High shear, low cape. Bottom line is that you don't really need a lot of instability in the second season or the fall to create storms. Actually, here in Maryland, near DC, there's 8 tornadoes in about 30 minutes, which resulted in only like 2 of cape only like less than 500. But the wind shear was over 40, 50 knots, so the wind shear was incredible. Now, I'm not saying there's going to be like 8 tornadoes tomorrow for Delmarva or the general risk area, but again, I would not be surprised if there's a tornado that eventually is reported. Now, unlike the fall setup, the dew points will actually be pretty good. This would be moderate dew points even for the summertime. Now, as that warm sector starts to lift north towards northern New Jersey, Long Island, and Connecticut, I could see some severe storms. Probably not going to produce any tornadoes as the bigger risk is more south towards Delaware, but but in terms of the dew points, the moisture, it is going to be very much there. So again, a tornado or 2 cannot be ruled out. The better chance is once that morning convection gets out of the way, it can destabilize once again, and storms can really fire. So there's that. Now this is the latest sounding from the HRRR, one of the cams we use, or the convective available models, and it's one of the more bullish so far. The NAM is not as aggressive, however, the HRRR is more aggressive. Now, breaking this down rather simply, you see again that stout EML at the mid levels really helping this create it. If this was moist at this level, you would most likely have just like a giant mess of storms or rain. So there's that. And at the surface, again, really good dew point for near December and good temperatures. So there's that. The LCL, or the lift and condensation level, or just a cloud base is going to be enough, more than plenty enough to pretty much bring a moisture. And these are going to be not too low topped, but not huge, probably about 30,000 feet high. So what you might see is reflectivity on the radar might not look great, but it's going to produce those winds. Now, these cells are probably going to have winds up to 50 to 60 miles an hour ahead of it. And you can see those lapse rates on the bottom left are actually pretty good. So I would not be surprised if there's some storms that had hail in it from the Outer Banks all the way up to Delmarva. Now going to the wind bulbs, there's wind shear, wind turning its heights pretty strong, And with the photograph, you have pretty good winds turning with height. The 1 kilometer vector is about 60 knots, which is pretty fast. And again, you just have a pretty good turning of winds. Now, this is the more bullish model. The name is not as aggressive, so you probably won't really see this put out, although the name doesn't really like to be as aggressive for the warm sectors at this time of year, while the HRR likes to be more aggressive. So we want to really put that in between. So I do think there will be severe storms, and I would expect there's going to be a tornado warning for Delmarva somewhere. So that's between Cape Charles and Dover, the main area. A lot of the SPC and people on Twitter are saying more south towards Salisbury and Cape Charles, but the latest cams actually want to put this towards like Dover and Centerville and Goldsboro. So I will most likely be there. I will tell you my full storm chasing plan once this is done. So let's go from the tornadoes, which is in the afternoon by sunset. I know 4:30 sunsets, it's crazy, to the rain, which is going to be more of a morning issue. So the WPC has put the entire peninsula of Delmarva under a marginal risk north of the border with Maryland. Now, there's a couple ways. Now, there's a couple of reasons why this is. I will explain this to you briefly. But the bottom line is, going back to that discussion on the subtropical and polar jet stream, is that the southern stream of this is tapping into Gulf moisture. And what happens a lot with heavy rain setups is that if that southern stream goes into the Gulf and picks up moisture, the Gulf is still relatively warm. It's above average a bit. Not like the summer, but it's still pretty warm. Essentially picks up moisture, and as it interacts with that polar jet, it forms a cold front. Now, the surface low at this point is way up into Canada, but there's enough moisture left behind where it rains. Now, this image is Monday night around 7 o'clock, where the rain is well away from the system. It's nice and dry, but this is a general setup of what you have. A nice subtropical jet going in the Gulf, picking up moisture, and the polar jet is essentially absorbing that. Now, we saw this during, I forget what tropical systems we have a lot. I think it was like Beta and Zeta and Sally. We had the tropical storms being absorbed by the polar jet, or the trough, and just raining, just general. This is the same setup, really no tropical system, except it's a relatively strong jet stream over the Gulf of Mexico, which is, again, why we will have this content of moisture and heavy rain. Now, speaking of moisture, it's going to be in essentially a fire hose of tropical moisture. Now, you might say, what does this mean? What do the blues and the purples mean? Now, generally around this time, we are about the PWatts of less than 1, which isn't that moist. It's more dry because it's wintertime. Our wet season is more in the summer months, and the wintertime, fall, it's not really that. It's between like dry and wet. But this is, of course, different. The surface low is the L over West Virginia. That will cause snow in Ohio, Michigan. I'll talk about that more later. But it will essentially drag up moisture from the Gulf of Mexico and bring plentiful rain to the northeast and mid-Atlantic. Now, as some of you might know, the northeast is still in a pretty decent drought. They've been in a drought since the summertime. They actually peaked as a Category 4 drought a couple months ago before they got a ton of rain. But they are still in a drought. This might not wipe out the drought, but it is going to bring it down to the lowest levels, which is great. Now, let's talk about how does this relate to average in terms of the PWatt values. Now, I found this on the SPC website, This is the climatology page. It's pretty good. And this is how the perceptual water values, or PWatts, have been compared to average and how it's going to be. Now, tomorrow is the last day of this month, and as you can see, we will probably break another record. I know, we broke, I think, three records between September and now in terms of PWatts, and we'll probably break one tomorrow. The record is 1.58. I'm not sure when that was set, but we will break this. And this is about 2.5 standard deviations, or 250% above the average. So this is a lot. If this was the summertime, you're probably talking about those values of 3, which would be a borderline tropical system. This is not this is not going to be affected by a tropical cyclone, but it is going to be part of the tropics, where this moisture is coming from. Now let's talk about the basic setup. This is pretty much basic meteorology, but you have a triple point, or where the cold front and warm front meet on a fully stacked low pressure system. Now, what this means is that the surface low is the same at the same level in the same area, all the way up to the highest part of the atmosphere. Now, this means the storm is fully occluded, it's at its mature stage, and it's at its strongest. Not really strongest because it's going to get stronger towards Canada, but it is pretty strong. Now, the warm front, that's your warm sector. Once that warm front lifts north, you'll have a very brief time of warm weather before that cold front moves through around sunset. This is for 1 o'clock tomorrow, so the best chance of storms for Delmarva is going to be between 12 and 4 o'clock. Now, whenever that AM rain moves out in the morning, should be done by noon, the atmosphere will have only a few hours to fully destabilize before sunset, and when that cold front moves through. So once that cold front's through, it's just going to be light rain showers and not a lot of dew points, and those temperatures will drop a little bit. And of course, you have the snow out in the Midwest and in the Pacific Northwest, but the topic of this video is mainly focused on the East Coast. Now how much is the NWS forecasting? More rain towards places like Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, because they are in a favorable axis of the jet stream as that plume of moisture really shoots north. Here on Delmarva, I'm thinking they're a little bit on the low side. I'm thinking we could probably see over 1.25 inches, especially once you get north of Salisbury. But south of here, probably going to be half-inch rain to an inch. So I do think they are on the low side a bit. But again, the more rain's going to be more north into southern New England, where they really, really need that rainfall, and that's going to come. Now we've done severe weather, we've done rainfall. Now let's get to the wind part, which is personally my favorite thing to talk about. I'm a big wind fan. Now, if you go to windy.com, you will see this is more like a motion. I just got a screenshot. This is for 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. You see those sustained winds of 30 to 35 miles an hour along the coast. I do think those inland winds will be sustained winds of 20 tops, probably going to be gusting to 45 miles an hour. Again, gusts could reach 55 on the coast, and it's really going to be windy the entire day because the wind advisory does go till 6 o'clock, but the strongest winds are going to be really until that cold front comes, and then that backside is going to be pretty windy as well. But again, the strongest winds will most likely be in the morning hours. Now, as you'll see, this relates to coastal flooding, which I'll talk about later in the next slide. But you see all that wind is pointing towards like the Delaware Bay, the ocean. Surprisingly, coastal flooding is not going to be a factor along the Atlantic Ocean, but it is going to be an issue for the back bays. It's like Little Assawoman Bay, Indian River Inlet area, Assawoman Bay, Chincoteague Bay, Chesapeake Bay, Delaware Bay, pretty much all of the back bays and the bays are going to have some flooding. Now, that's because the water can't funnel into the ocean side. As you'll see, the Delaware Bay is more like concave. It's kind of funnels in water. The bays also are pretty small, so the water's going to have time to rise. It's not going to be a lot of water, probably about a foot max, but there's that. Now let's go to each site. So this is Barrows Beach, which is one of the more vulnerable areas across the peninsula, along the Delaware Bay. Now this is north of Slaughter Beach. It's just east of Frederica, Delaware, off of Route 1. It's about 10 miles east of Frederica. So the forecast has been trending up a little bit for Barrows Beach. It might have some moderate flooding possible. High and minor is forecasted, so pretty much Slaughter Beach starts to flood, and all of those roads leading in, especially along the marshes, will flood a bit. You will see water on those roads, and even inland towards like Frederica. I think it's Big Creek. Those towns might have some flooding. And high tide is at 9 a.m. So the morning high tide, once you wake up, don't be surprised to see some areas flooded, especially those low-lying spots along the Delaware Bay. Now switching to the Atlantic side, or closer to the Atlantic side towards Lewis, Delaware, this is still the Delaware Bay. I'm not really expecting a lot of flooding for you all, maybe some isolated flooding towards the Cape May Lewis Ferry Terminal, but not going to be huge problem for you all, maybe about a half foot of water rise. Not going to be a huge issue for you all. High tide is just after 8 o'clock in the morning. Now switching to the Chesapeake Bay towards Annapolis, your high tide is actually after sunset at 5:36. Again, moderate flooding is possible. The Stevens Ensemble has been pointing at moderate for the last few days, so you all might get some moderate flooding. So it could be pretty decent. Now, the water should recede, of course, within the next few hours after every high tide cycle. Now, the National Weather Service has issued a coastal flood advisory for the entire peninsula, like Delaware, but mainly for the Delaware Bay. So I'll just read this off. So it's going to be, the main effect is going to be from 6 a.m. until noon. Tomorrow, maybe, I would not be surprised if Sterling has issued one, or will have one out for the Chesapeake Bay, because this is all from Mount Holly. So Sterling should have one for Annapolis. So basically, it's going to be up to 1 foot of water rise, mainly focusing along the Delaware Bay towards Barrows Beach. So I'm not really concerned about Lewis or the side on the ocean. But, so flooding again, you all know the drill. Flooding begins at the most vulnerable roads in coastal and especially bayside areas. So roads are going to be below water. You all know what roads do flood, what roads do not flood. And there's probably going to be some road closures. I'm not sure what road it is, but there's some road that goes right along the Delaware Bay that's not really protected, like Route 17, I think. So that's probably closed because the waves are going to be 3 feet high. So that's most likely going to be closed. So again, they really highlight the entire area, although they specifically say the Delaware Bay, the tidal areas, and the Little Assawoman Bay, so like Fenwick Island and Bethany, you're really being discussed for this. So bottom line is that don't leave your car out. It might be an issue, but it's advisory, probably for the water. So if you do flood a lot, don't have your car there. It's not going to go well, but there's that. Alright, now I know all of you Ohio and Michigan people want to hear about the snow. I'm going to briefly talk about the snow. I'll also mention North Carolina a little bit. Now, I just pulled up the model which I think is handling this the best, although it is a little high towards Cleveland and Erie. bottom line, pretty much going to be 3 to 5 inches for much of western Ohio, although parts of eastern Ohio are going to mix. So there's that. And even the mountains of West Virginia and could see some snow from this. And the stuff that I'm pretty interested in, what's going to happen, is the mountains of North Carolina, where they could see up to a half foot of snow, while those winds could gust up to 50 miles an hour. Now, my storm chasing plans for tomorrow my plans for storm chasing is going to be wake up around 6 o'clock, have some breakfast, head over to Bowers Beach, see if the roads are closed. If not, I'll drive as far as I can until I can. And then I'll probably come back. I have class at 12. And then I'm going to meet up with possibly a few chasers and chase the severe weather side of this system. Now, this pretty much concludes the live stream of this. So thank you all for tuning in. I will be pretty much rehashing this on Twitter, and I will see you all later. Have a great day. Shit, Megan. God damn it.